the nature of the textbook. Anchored by a central set of libraries based on wiki technology for at-scale collaborative construction and distribution efforts. The OER content in the libraries are decorated with ancillary technologies, where the LibreText libraries are working with Adapt, a homework system, Jupyter, which is kind of like a 3D display of technologies, interactive forums, and then there's some other things that aren't really too much interactive, such as the bot servers, the JavaScript servers, which is really doing a lot of the background content that we have over here. So the LibreText accessibility standards, where we are attempting to meet the WCAG 2.1 level AA by October 2022. Why WCAG 2.1? Well, it provides more support for users with limited vision, as well as cognitive and learning disabilities, dexterity and motor disabilities, as well as mobile device users. There was 17 more tests that we could include to adhere to by this time.
So just to provide a very brief update on the accessibility work that LibreText has been undertaking, we're in the process of conducting a comprehensive accessibility audit of all the different technologies available through LibreText, especially those that are student-facing or what students would use and what instructors are going to be using to add content to LibreText. We're developing accessibility conformance reports, ACRs, and sometimes you might hear that referred to as a VPAT, VPAT. And we're breaking it down by the particular feature or technology, by the user, whether it's going to be used by the student, instructor, or general. We're also including usability guides, which we're going to be sharing a little bit of information about that very shortly, and product roadmaps. So the difference between the accessibility conformance report and the roadmap is the report is a snapshot of where the accessibility of that particular feature for that particular user is at the time we run the report. And the product roadmap is where we're going. So it would include information about when you might expect some of the identified accessibility barriers to be addressed. And the LibreText accessibility statement is a link that will be part of the presentation materials, and that's being updated as we have more information available.
So the LibreText usability guides is a set of guides that were created by students for students. So this is a view of the table of contents of the LibreText guide that we're creating. We use Claro Read, Read and Write, and Captive Voice in order to read the content within the web pages. Captive Voice is kind of like an updated version of Claro for Kurzweil. We also used NVDA, VoiceOver, and JAWS in order to test the screen reader capabilities. Right now, it's still being created because every time something's adjusted in LibreText, we do have to update the usability guide. And these guides are step-by-step procedures on how to interact with all the different areas within LibreText. So we're writing it up for the main LibreText area. We're writing it up on how to interact with these different areas within the React sidebar, which is kind of a little interactive tool for users to use to interact with the LibreText textbooks. Hypothesis, Adapt, and LibreText Commons, we're writing a little bit of everything for students to help to guide students using these textbooks.
So as we mentioned at the top, LibreText revolves around these 14 different libraries that are based on this wiki style technology that really promotes revision and collaboration. We pretty much cover all the bases here. We have 8 STEM libraries, including medicine. We have the humanities and social sciences, K-12 education, business and workforce, and finally a library dedicated solely to content in Spanish. While each library focuses on different subject matter, they all run the same wiki software, and we make every effort to ensure that the editing and the reading experiences are uniform across them. Next slide, please. So in the student-facing view, or at least when you're not editing content, there's a pretty standard layout, including this breadcrumb navigation menu up at the top. Just before the start of the content, we have the export options menu, primarily PDFs, but soon to be expanded, and a link to the readability options, which we'll cover more in just a moment. The readability options exist in what Joshua mentioned, the sidebar, this global menu on the left-hand side of every page. It includes the table of contents of the current text, some STEM references, links to all the other libraries, and a lot of tools for our content authors. Now, while content authoring is done in a visual editor, what the libraries spit out at the end of the day is plain HTML, just like any other web page. And that's exactly what assistive tech interacts with, like screen readers. Now, before we had PDFs and before we had print books, the web pages were, and more or less remain, the primary method in which people interact with our content. So these libraries are really the main influence behind our desire and our need to meet those WCAG standards. Next slide.
And now we're talking about the library accessibility checker, which is one of the things that we are building with inside of the LibreTexts library for the textbooks. So this is something that as you are editing your textbooks, you can now, we have now enabled a little Darwin icon that you can find inside of the editing tool area, where you can automatically check a lot of fixes. So it'll check for URLs, it'll check for heading issues, it'll check for image alts, it'll even check for table accessibility. What I have a picture over here is you have a little blue dotted box that goes around the accessibility checker. Then you have an orange dotted box that goes around the actual issue. And it will tell you what the issue is inside of here. Now, for image alts, we have done a little something different. We have limited it to 150 characters. And if it's over 150 characters, it will automatically be applied as a caption to help those with learning disabilities get the same information as those with screen readers. Tables now will have captions embedded inside of them. It will require user interaction, but it will automatically put in whatever the user enters inside of there without having to know the code to make the tables accessible. It will group sub-columns inside of tables correctly within headers. This is something that has been enabled within the last week. So we do want people using this and giving feedback. And right now, that is what we are looking for. I do have a list of checks that we have currently applied to the accessibility checker. And then there is a list of checks that we can still apply, which is much, much longer. So the readability tool inside of the React sidebar is one of the areas that enables a few accessibility options right out the box. So opening up the React sidebar and going and activating the readability area allows you to change the size of the text. You can also change the size of the margins. So that way you have wider margins on the side if you so choose. Then there's also dark mode. So you can make everything white, dark, and everything that's dark into light colors. Then, as you can see, there's also Beeline Reader, which you can really quickly apply to any of your textbooks. So that way you can read text in a color gradient view. So for those students who prefer not to get text to speech, but want a different way of reading their text, this is something that's built into our textbooks. We also have MathML and MathJax built in. So it displays math content. It even supports screen reading. So we have been doing tests. We've been using TalkBack and Chrome. We've been using Safari and VoiceOver, both on mobile and on your desktop. And we have been using mostly NVDA and Chrome in order to read a lot of this content out loud. And as you can see with MathJax, it has inline display math that will display math within paragraphs, and then it has display math, which is nothing but the equation. These will get read out loud, and you can read it across either your desktop or mobile devices. Now, we also have some other features inside of here that are a little different. So headings 5 and 6 will, well, headings 5 are going to indicate little special boxes like definition, examples, interactive elements, or learning objectives, while heading 6 are going to be subheadings within these areas. We're coding that inside of our bots to make sure that those don't get wiped out. We also have another accessibility bot that looks at long alt text and heading structure, empty links, suspicious link text and iframe labels, and will automatically fix a lot of these for you. So this is something that we're thinking about, how we can automate a lot of it rather than giving you a report and telling you this is what needs to be fixed. We're fixing it directly within the tool.
And just to follow up a little bit about the heading 5 and heading 6, thank you, Jenna, for your comment. That is something that was a request from content authors to be able to have a way to include sidebar content that would traditionally be part of a text in a way that would still support users of assistive technology. So we're adding that instruction to the usability guide, and it's also kind of for the technical side. If you read the accessibility conformance reports, we're going to be including that as what we call equivalent functionality. So it's a way to provide the same type of accessibility, even if we're not strictly following the do not skip heading levels or using heading levels out of order. It's more familiar than other options. So another library accessibility feature that we've added, or that we're in the process of adding, is the Able player. And this is a player that supports both audio and video. The first image we have is an example of the audio player, and it includes an icon or an option for a transcript, so that that text transcript would not need to be synchronized for only audio content. And then if you can just go forward for me, Josh. In addition, there's the video player version of Able Player, and this will include support for transcript that's interactive, that would be synchronized. It also supports audio description. Now, both the transcript for the video and the audio, as well as the audio description or the captions, in this case too for video, all that content needs to be provided by the content authors. But as with a lot of the functionality that LibreTexts is adding or improving, it's making sure that the content authors have the tools to meet the accessibility standards. Then another, which we kind of mentioned, option is export to EPUB. So right now there's currently an option to export to PDF, but EPUB is a format that better supports many of the accessibility features and the content structures. It's very flexible, and with similar to PDF readers, users can choose a variety of EPUB readers to use that information. We're also looking forward to much better support for math content, similar to MathJax on the HTML pages. And it ties into the option of printing books at low cost. So students would have that option if they want a hard copy, whether it's for an accommodation or just because they want the hard copy. Next slide.
Okay, so one of these newer technologies here in the LibreVerse is this bimodal kind of two-sided system we call Commons and Conductor. At the public-facing or student-centered side up on the screen, we have a catalog that allows you to thumb through and search and filter the great majority of our texts in a central location. Not only can you search through them, you can see overview information, look at their table of contents, even jump directly to a section. And you can download any of the export options we have and get the direct link to our physical bookstore. Next slide, please. Once you've created an account, if you're an author, you get access to this Conductor portion of the system. Conductor is an increasingly powerful project organizing and planning tool for building and reviewing OER content. What we have on the screen here is the landing or dashboard page, which gives you some quick links to LibreTexts tools, your recently edited projects, and system announcements on the right, which is one of several ways we're working to increase communication in our little corner of the community. Next slide. So this is an example of a project page inside Conductor, which shows you some of those project tracking aspects, some of the metadata we allow you to store about your project, and what I call the rainbow menu bar up at the top, which leads you to some of the other organizing tools. I'm not going to go into too much detail here about all the Conductor features. We're incredibly enthusiastic about it. I could spend easily an hour on it. If you are interested in all the things you can do with it and you weren't able to attend the official introduction we had on Tuesday, that will be up on our YouTube channel shortly. And of course, we're always here for questions. What I do want to point out here is this accessibility progress meter we have on the right-hand side. This is set manually right now by your team, but will soon be tied to the tools we have under that accessibility tab up at the top. And if I can get the next slide. So one of these tools we're particularly excited about is the Accessibility Compliance Review Matrix. This is a matrix that places all the sections of your text along the vertical and around 30 different criteria that our team uses currently along the horizontal that you can use to ensure that your content is up to standard and as widely as accessible as possible. Coming soon are those accessibility review bots Joshua touched on that will perform automated checks on content and highlight what needs to be improved. Using the review matrix in these bots, we're essentially approaching the ability to create an ACR for each text at the text level. We really think this will be helpful for potential adopters to identify how feasible it is to incorporate the OER content into their courses. Lastly, and this is actually more back on the student-facing comment side, we're planning a reader mode that will essentially strip away all the excess decoration and the navigation and buttons and place a focus on the text content itself, along with better support for assistive tech like screen readers. Next slide, please. So up on the screen is the current state of the Accessibility Compliance Review Matrix. We've got the sections and the criteria aligned, like I mentioned, and up at the top, we have the accessibility score, which is essentially the number of sections compared to the number of criteria checked or attained, whatever you want to call that. We also have the sync table of contents button, which, as you can imagine, if your project is particularly connected to a specific LibreText on the libraries, that allows you to grab all the sections at once and generate the matrix for your whole text in a couple clicks, really. As powerful as it is in its current state, we actually have an update planned in the next few weeks to break this into 3 different sections or smaller matrices. One of those will be checks and fixes that your construction team would perform. Another is criteria related to LibreText as a platform, which is done by our team for everybody. And finally, the section that will be completed on a ruling basis automatically by those aforementioned review bots, which we are hoping to roll out probably by the summer. So hopefully you can see how powerful this tool is and its future potential. We think it definitely fills a longstanding need in the community. These kind of tools help ensure accessibility from the start instead of going back and editing and fixing up long after construction of a text is complete. This also is a method of transparency and community education. You know, when you have these criteria out for any author to get familiar with and check for, everybody benefits. There's no 2 ways about that. So we're really excited to see how this improves our content body as a whole. Next slide, please. Okay, switching gears here. Another LibreVerse tech is the LibreStudio. LibreStudio is our publicly browsable catalog of formative assessments built on a framework called H5P. If you're not familiar, H5P is a flexible technology that allows you to create some really cool interactive and activities and assessments as complements to your OER text. Again, we won't go into too much detail about authoring and creating H5P here, but if you're interested in that, we can definitely get you an author registration code. And tomorrow, our product manager, Yassine, is actually hosting a dedicated session on the LibreStudio at 12:30 Pacific. Next slide, please.
So specific to the LibreStudio H5P library, we have a few accessibility features, and some of these are tied back to the underlying H5P technology. What we've done is we have created accessibility status by H5P activity type. I believe there are 49 activity types currently available. And while we don't have the capacity to do a comprehensive audit of each of those types of activities, we've done an accessibility report for each of those H5P activity types. So whether you're looking at drag and drop, multiple choice, fill in the blanks, whichever interactive activity, we now have an accessibility report available. And in addition, because we're identifying that many of those activities are going to require some type of modification up to the most inaccessible or less usable types of H5P activities, it may require an alternative type of activity. So you might have a drag and drop activity that isn't going to be accessible for all users, and so you create a multiple choice version of it. So we have set up some H5P accessible alternative examples, and the links to all of those resources are going to be included in this in the presentation materials. But I'm going to show you a couple of examples next. Next slide. So for the H5P accessibility status by activity type, we used 6 guidelines. And for anyone who has done a little bit of accessibility checking or considering or been to any type of trainings, these guidelines are probably going to be very familiar, and you'll recognize that they're high level. So we're not using a specific success criterion tied to WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 or any other specific accessibility standard, because again, this is not a comprehensive audit. We're using guidelines to try to provide some strategies and techniques for content authors to be able to make an informed decision about how they might want to use these activities, but also to come up with some potential workarounds. So we're looking at visible indication of focus, which is very important for users with limited vision or who are only using the keyboard. We're looking at color contrast, and that includes the 2.1 standards. So we're looking at not only for text, but for images and for different interactive elements, form elements. We're looking at overall keyboard usability. We're checking for no keyboard traps, because that is a functionality that's a barrier that could completely inhibit somebody from being able to use the activity. We're checking for support for magnification, not only at the 200% level with the browser tools, but also considering mobile users. So that would be at the 400% magnification or at a width of 320 pixels, so that a user would not be required to scroll horizontally. And then we're also checking for usability with screen reading software. And again, that's a general usability. And by checking for usability with screen reading software, we're also covering a lot of different types of users of assistive technology. So in LibreStudio, when a content author chooses to create or even review an existing activity, on the sidebar, there's going to be several different features or information about that. And one of those is now the accessibility status. So in this example, we have accessibility, and this particular type of activity would be labeled usable with workarounds. So that's actually a link. And if we go to the next animation, by selecting that link, the content author is going to have additional information about what does that mean for this particular activity. So this example is for the column activity in H5P. It explains what does usable with workarounds mean. So in this case, it's the activity requires significant adjustment by content authors. So we want to let content authors know immediately that by choosing to use this H5P activity, there may be a need for a certain level of adjustments. We provide important reminders and detailed information about all 6 of the different guidelines. There's also a link to an example of the type of H5P activity. Currently, it's what H5P is providing itself. And then next slide. So we have on the summary for the accessibility reviews of the H5P, of the H5P activities. It's very similar to an accessibility conformance report. We've got a list of all the activities with links to additional information and a definition of the conformance level. So we're rating the activities either as usable with best practices, which means the activity requires minimal adjustments by content authors. And currently there are only 5 of the activities that rated at that level. So it doesn't mean that there are no adjustments that need to be made to ensure that the activity is accessible, but by using best practices for content authoring, which are standard best practices, the activity should be very usable by a lot of different types of users, regardless of what type of disability they have or what type of assistive technology they're using. Additionally, it may be that the workaround would require very minimal effort on the part of the content author. The second conformance level is usable with workarounds. And so that label means the activity requires significant adjustment by content authors. 25 of the total activities are rated at that level. And then the third level is requires alternate activity. The activity is not usable by some users. There are 16 activities, H5P activities, that are rated at this level. For those activities, it's going to be very important that content authors look at including and creating right away an accessible alternative, because there are going to be groups who will not be able to use the activity effectively. And then there were 3 activities that were not evaluated because that particular activity type isn't going to be used by most faculty members. And it was similar, I think it was like Twitter or something like that, where we didn't even have access to evaluate that information. Next slide. So here's an example of an H5P accessibility barrier. And again, the link is going to be in these presentation materials. So we've set up some examples where we will describe the accessibility barriers for a particular H5P activity. In this case, we have marked the words, and we'll list what are some of the concerns. So in this case, the mark the words activity is currently not usable with screen reading software. There's no support for programmatic headings. Now, the programmatic headings issues, if the content author in LibreTexts uses a box to add a heading, and right now it would be the heading level 5, in LibreTexts, we have a workaround for that. So when we can add features to LibreTexts to address some of the known accessibility barriers with H5P, we're going ahead and doing that. And then if we go to the next slide, this is an example of a more accessible alternative for the previous example using mark the words. So rather than using the less accessible version, we would create at the same time we're creating the mark the words version of the activity, a more accessible multiple choice. And in this case, it's a question about signs and symptoms of respiratory failure. And the student was given a list of signs and symptoms, and they needed to check which, or they needed to select in the mark the words activity, which of those were correct. So to convert it into a multiple choice, 4 different combinations were created. And so there are still distractors. It's going to still require the student to evaluate the different options. So we believe that there is a way to structure some of the more accessible alternatives that H5P activities offer and still meet those formative learning objectives. Next slide. Am I talking about this one, Josh? Yes, I think I am. Okay, so another feature, another technology that we have in LibreTexts is the Adapt Homework System. And this is a summative system. The example that we have here is specifically in Spanish because we don't really want to focus on the actual content of the activity. Although I know I have some of my colleagues who we worked on this particular text, so they're going to be able to understand the content, but we don't want to focus on the content so much. So the Adapt Homework System can use several different types of technologies. And it's similar to a lot of different homework systems. It can have multiple types of questions. It can have a group of questions as an assignment. It's got a grade book. It can support auto-graded submissions as well as open-ended submissions for the different types of activities. The example we have is an H5P activity. It includes the attribution for that activity. So again, that's supporting the open education resource model. Next slide.
Okay, and then we have the adapt accessibility features. Thanks for answering that last question there, Nicolas. I was on mute when you were asking that. So the adapt accessibility features will include H5P, web work, MyOpenMath, and adapt open-ended questions. Some third-party questions may not be fully accessible, as we have seen on previous slides. The instructors can also be assigned alternative questions to a student if the questions have been created, and accessible alternatives may include auto-graded questions as well as open-ended questions. And so my team is also working on this inside of the usability guides. So for those students who may be unfamiliar with using assistive technologies with the questions, there will be a whole usability guide for being able to interact with the questions for students as well. We are not building one for how staff interacts with it, because we find that in most cases, it's our students who are learning the technology as they're coming in, and we're just trying to be helpful and make sure that they have access to these materials. And then I'll move on to the next slide to Nick Lum.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking a bit about the Beeline Reader feature that Joshua mentioned earlier. I'm the creator of Beeline Reader, and I'm happy to be joining in today to talk with everyone. I'll be demoing the technology. You can see it on screen right now, and then talking about what types of students and people this is helpful for and why it is it helps, and some quantification of that as well. So on this slide, we have a demonstration of the Beeline Reader technology. Beeline Reader is an alternative text format that applies a color gradient to text, and critically, the color gradient wraps from the end of one line to the beginning of the following line. And the reason for this is to improve visual tracking. It allows you to move your eyes very quickly from the right side of the screen to the left side, and they will automatically be drawn to the appropriate line, the subsequent line, because the color matches up. This is a demo here. I'll give you a second to read it while I'm not talking so you can concentrate. All right, Josh, next slide. So this is a quote. It feels like the first time I tried glasses. And the reason I include this here is some people who don't have dyslexia or ADHD or other types of reading challenges may not really understand what it's like to try to read or to slog through reading for people who have these challenges. And on the other hand, many people have glasses. I understand if you didn't have your glasses on, if you've never had glasses, it'd be very difficult to read. And so this really puts it in context for folks so they can understand the magnitude of difference that it makes for people who have dyslexia or ADHD or other types of learning differences that make it difficult to read. Next slide. So you might be wondering, how does this affect reading and from a more objective or data-driven perspective, as opposed to the subjective perspective, which of course is very important, but is more anecdotal. On this slide, we have a chart that shows how long students spent reading in a reading platform called StoryShares. StoryShares is a nonprofit literacy organization focused on students with dyslexia, ADHD, and other reading challenges. And they put Beeline Reader on their platform years after LibreTexts had. LibreTexts had it a long time ago, but StoryShares got it last year, and they gathered some data to see how students were interacting with the platform with and without Beeline. And they found that students who had activated the feature on their platform were spending more than double the amount of time reading compared to the students who were reading with traditional black text. So this is a huge boon for our students who have reading challenges, and it encourages them to read more than they would otherwise read, which is great. When you've got required reading, it means they're actually doing the reading. Next slide. We have seen similar results when it comes to general audience readerships. So the StoryShares platform is specifically for students with LD, but we actually see that students and people more generally engage with content for longer when they're reading with the Beeline Reader technology. For example, CNET did a trial and found that people who were reading with Beeline in some of their longer form articles were engaging with the text longer and reading about 45% more than people reading traditional black text. I think the article completion rate was 35% higher, so it's really pushing people through the articles. We've also seen that it encourages people to click through and read more on websites. Another site that integrated the technology found, again, about a 45 or 50% increase in the number of pages per session. So that means when someone comes to a site, how many pages they read. And so really it's increasing scroll depth, amount of time spent in the content, and the number of times someone's willing to click to read that next page, which is great for keeping students engaged. Next slide. If you want to learn more about Beeline Reader, you can go to the Beeline Reader website. There's information there, as well as links to specific tools for different types of platforms. There are browser plugins and PDF plugins and iOS apps and things like that, as well as information on our various integrations like we have with LibreTexts. And if you have any specific questions, you can always email me directly at nick@beelinereader.com. Happy to take questions now along with everyone else.
So Q&A time. We finished up in record time. I just want to make sure that there's a lot of information. If there's any slides that we need to go over again, or if there's anything that needs some clarification, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I will move over to another page where there is a lot of hyperlinks to the LibreVerse. So a lot of resource hyperlinks, so project organization and curation, the remixer, community and curation forums, the adapt, as well as LibreStudio. So we have quite a bit here for you to reference, and we welcome you to reach out and if you have any questions.
So we do have a question from Jenna in the chat. Earlier, I asked about how LibreTexts will make auto-captioned YouTube videos accessible when in the text. So that's a good question. And similar to other content that is provided by the content authors, LibreTexts isn't generally going to be able to go back and fix those types of accessibility issues. So we really encourage content authors to adopt or to provide those types of materials already in an accessible format. Now, that's the nice thing about open education resources. If an institution needs to make sure that text that's available in LibreTexts does include videos that are fully captioned, you can always create your own version or remix and then change that content so you can change out that video. So if another institution also wants to supply a new video, then we can look at replacing it with the captions and or the audio description that's needed.
We had another question came in. Thank you so much for this information. My question, and forgive me if you covered this earlier, as I was listening while driving at the beginning, but if we have a project in our sandbox right now, or if we have content that has already been published on LT, will these accessibility checkers, etc., automatically be applied, or is this only with new content going forward? Great question, Sarah. The accessibility checkers were made available as of last week. For authors, that is actually available for authors when you go to edit textbooks. You can apply it at any time right now. This one is not automatically applied. This is one that authors do have to apply to the text that they're entering, and it will do an accessibility check and kind of guide you through what needs to be fixed and so forth. The accessibility bots, the ones that we were talking about earlier, those are ones that check and fix everything from the beginning of time and going forward. So we made sure that a lot of our bots went backwards in time and then just moves forward so that way all books are the same way.
And just to add a little bit more to that question, we do look at, or to that answer, we look at the LibreTexts platform really, I guess, in three parts. There are certain platform accessibility issues that a content author, regardless of how much work you do on your particular text, you're not going to be able to change because it's part of the platform. So we are working to make those updates so that those accessibility issues, if a third party were to run an automated checker, they're not going to find those because we've resolved them. Then there are the accessibility issues that we can go back and fix with the bots. So similar to what Josh was just saying. But there's a whole group of accessibility issues that do rely manual checking to make sure, is it an accessibility issue or not, or how to proceed with applying the correction. And so LibreTexts is working with a group of students and some supports, and I think Josh might be able to answer a little more about that. But there are several texts that are kind of going through, and they'll be using that accessibility matrix and having humans verify and do as much of the correcting that can happen. Depending on the text, it may require making some modifications. So I think LibreTexts in general is still deciding how the scope of modifications are going to be negotiated with certain content authors. Some might not be, they might not seem very significant. For example, a content author may have chosen to use a heading 4 because they like the way it looks, even though it needs to be a heading 3. Well, I would be very comfortable making the executive decision. The programmatic use of heading for consistency trumps the stylistic choice. But there's going to be some discussions about that.
That's actually what one of the bots automatically does without telling the author.
So we have another question from Delmar, or Delmar was asking if we did showcase the ACR matrix and the conductor. Yes, we did. We didn't actually do a live version, but we can walk through that if people want to see that.
I can also share my screen if everyone would like a live.
Yep. Why don't you go for it, Ethan?
Okay. Okay. Everyone can see this, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to go into a fake project here. So again, I'm in the project page. I've got all the various metadata along with tasks and discussions and things like that. But of course, we're interested in accessibility here. We do have a dedicated discussions area for accessibility related things. And here, of course, is what we're actually interested in, the accessibility compliance review matrix. So let's do this live. I don't know, does anybody have a favorite textbook they want to see done? Let's do an aerospace book. And we will do aerodynamics. So I copy the link here, go back here, go into my edit properties. And then all I have to do is paste the link to the LibreTexts book here, and it will automatically pull all the little extra data that it needs. Go back to accessibility. And now that I have the link and the sort of connection made there, I can sync the table of contents. Basically, this is going to be improved in the near future, but basically import it and overwrite everything, or import it and try and save your current progress. So we'll just import everything. And like I mentioned, boom, the entire sections, maybe this text is not perfectly organized, but we've got every single section, including all the extra front matter and the back matter. So there's all our sections, and then we can slide across here to see all of those. I think we're at about 35 criteria that Nicolas and all of our accessibility team uses right now to manually check content. So basically, you pick a section. Maybe I want to do chapter 1, Introduction to Aerodynamics. I'm going to focus on images. I've checked all my images have meaningful alt text, maybe using the brand new accessibility checker that's on the platform. And I just toggle it on. And all of our images are decorative or not. Maybe all of this is something that would probably be checked by a bot in the near future, text contrast. All text is larger, and then maybe let's do chapter 9. I'm checking the headings here. There's no empty headings, and they all follow the proper, structure level. And the perfect thing is, if I leave and I come back, just as you would probably expect, all of that gets saved. So no matter who, and you can have as many people on your team as you like. So no matter who's on your team, everyone gets the same matrix and everyone stays in sync with the checks that are being done. So no one has to do things twice. No one, no extra work is wasted there. I hope it's pretty intuitive. And then of course, the goal is to check as many of these as possible, right? And then like we mentioned, in the near future, this is going to be broken into 3 smaller matrices. There will be more criteria, but a good portion of those extra criteria you don't have to do yourself, because the one is done at the LibreTexts platform level as we fix issues and is updated without your intervention. And then the bot checks, those are also done without your intervention on a rolling basis. We'll have some sort of schedule made to do those without anybody needing to come in and specially say, I need to do this now. But I'm sure we would have a button to say, I made a bunch of changes right now. Can we have these bots check these right now? So yeah, that's hopefully, like I said, I hope it's intuitive. Again, if you don't want to import the TOC, or maybe there's something preventing you there, you can manually add the sections here.
And I just want to mention the difference between the bots and the accessibility checker, where the bots, all of that is completely automated. The accessibility checker, in many cases, requires some kind of human interaction. So what text should we be using for this URL if you don't want to use the HTTPS? What caption should we be using for these tables? Because I've seen pages with 19 tables on them and none of them are captioned. So trying to navigate between each one of the tables with a screen reader was just horrible. Also, the alt text for the images, that can't be automated. That needs some kind of human interaction. So that was one of the reasons, that's one of the big differences between the bots and the accessibility checker built in to the LibreText editor.
I also want to answer, thank you, Nicolas, for mentioning, yes, we will have better instructions added to each of these criteria, so they're a little more clear. Sarah asked if we don't want to use, or if we didn't use Conductor for a previous or current sandbox project, but we do want to use the ACR, can we do this project? 100%, absolutely. All you need to do is make your project, and then like I demonstrated at the start, copy and paste the link, and you get complete access, whether it's new, old, in the works. You know, this is meant to be for everybody, no matter where they are in their stage on LibreTexts. So yes, absolutely.
And I know that Ethan did mention this during the presentation, but we want to underscore the value of this matrix. When we conduct an accessibility audit of a product, or in this case, it would be of a textbook, we're going through about almost 100 different checks and reporting on that, and then summarizing that information. This matrix will very soon be able to export that information. So essentially, you will be able to have an accessibility conformance report that included automated and manual accessibility checking per version of your textbook. This is something that, as far as we know, is new to this industry. You're not going to find this from publishers outside of LibreTexts. When you ask for an accessibility conformance report of a textbook, you generally get a sample of pages, not the full scope of content, and more information about the platform than the actual text. So we think this is going to be a very important and useful tool for institutions. Any other questions or features that you would like to see demonstrated?
Mentioning the team that I have, I probably have a team of maybe about 20 students, 20, 50, between that, actually probably around more like 17 students. I was rounding off there. So I have maybe about 6 or 7 students who are users of assistive technologies that are helping out creating the usability guides. We have low vision, we have a lot of text-to-speech users, and even a voice recognition user that's on the team. We have about 4 student programmers who are helping out with this accessibility checker. And then we have another about 4 or 5 students who are helping us with some of the alt tags creation for some of those textbooks that we have. So we have kind of a team of students that are addressing all different angles of this, of addressing the accessibility needs for these textbooks. So we are definitely users of the assistive technologies creating these guides. And we will be continuing to do other evaluations on how students interact with the hypothesis modules for note-taking within textbooks and sharing of notes, as well as working with the WebWorks, the H5P, and adapt content with assistive technologies. So these are all things that we are working to address before October. And the book is very huge so far. I mean, we're almost at 300 pages, and it's a growing book. So don't worry, we'll be breaking it up. Most of it is images. That's the reason why it's so long. But you can take the images out and it'll probably shrink to much smaller pages. all. I'm going to say thank you all for attending. Please feel free to try out the accessibility checker that's now available inside of LibreText. Send us feedback. We're always looking for feedback. You can reach me at jhori@ucdavis.edu. I put that inside of the channel in case you want to send any suggestions or want to provide any kind of feedback on that accessibility checker. Nicolas has also put in his email for his atconsultantnc@gmail.com, as well as Ethan Turner, eaturner@libretext.org. And then Nick puts in nick@beelinereader.com. I'm making sure I read all of this out loud for everybody, so that way you don't have to open up the chats and you can continue on with your day. I'm glad I could accommodate you by reading those out loud.